first concept I'm going to talk about is depth. And depth is essentially about how deep an image feels. It's about how far the image seems to descend away from where we are, the point of view of the camera. An image with depth will feel a lot more three-dimensional, which is obviously very important given that photography is inherently a two-dimensional discipline, and being able to make things feel more 3D makes them feel more real and therefore more interesting. So how can we go about creating more depth in our imagery? Well, the best practice is to create a foreground, a midground, and a background. Now, the foreground is generally the part of the image that's closest to us. Now, classically, people will put the foreground at the bottom of the image, naturally because the ground is at your feet, and therefore it just makes more logical sense. When we have the foreground at the bottom of an image, it encourages us to climb from the bottom up through the rest of the image. We can put things in the foreground that we want the viewer to see first. Now, there's a misunderstanding. I think everyone generally assumes that the foreground should be blurred out, the midground should be the point of interest, and the background should be blurred out too. This doesn't have to be the case. There's no reason that you can't put your subject or point of interest in the foreground. I mean, especially if it's something particularly small, it inherently might need to be. Objects that are in the foreground have a sense of primacy. They're the things that we perceive first. And that way, by placing things on the foreground, it might make them seem more important to us. And it certainly make them feel a lot closer to us. Putting things in the foreground is also a good way to create an emotional connection between you and that subject or object. If we don't include a foreground in our image, it makes us feel a bit further away. It makes it feel less like we, the viewer of the image, is actually there in the shot. Next, let's talk about the midground. So the midground is what it sounds like. It's the middle ground. It's the middle of an image. Generally, the midground is where you can expect most people to put their subject. There's a number of reasons as to why. Having that classic foreground, midground, background is just, as I said at the start, the best way to create depth. And depth creates interest. And another factor is the fact that most things that you're going to be photographing are too small for the foreground. And most things that you're going to be photographing are too large to be photographed on the foreground and are too small to be photographed on the background. So placing our subject in the midground, maybe with some foreground and background in front and behind it, will give us a relatively traditional image. And if we have a shot with only midground, it creates a very two-dimensional image. And finally, let's look at the background. The background is what you might imagine. It's the point that's furthest away from the camera. Now, generally, we use the background just to show us a little bit more information about the environment of our subject. So if we have a cowboy, you could imagine us having the cowboy out. You have to imagine the cowboy riding out his stallion in the midground, and then the background behind him being the sort of American Midwest desert. Often we use the background as a form of negative space to frame the subject. So we could have the subject in the midground or maybe in the foreground, and the background is the blue sky behind them or a desert. Generally, we like to have the subject have a lot of contrast with the background, and we don't want the area around the subject to be visually busy because it's distracting and it makes it hard to work out exactly where the subject is. If you've ever seen one of those Where's Waldo books, this is very much the concept. It's lots of busyness. There's too many points of interest. So we spend a very long time searching around trying to find our subject, and therefore it makes it a less satisfying image to look at. And not every subject, again, needs a background. We could just have the camera right up close and intimately on the subject's eye or face. Not having a background creates a very, very tense image. Or an alternative could be is that we just place our subject on the background. If we place our subject on the background, they become lost. They feel very small in the frame. They feel irrelevant. And this is a tactic we could use as well when we're trying to convey those kinds of emotions. So let's just recap. Why might we want to create depth? Creating depth makes us feel more like we're actually within the image. It makes the image feel more three-dimensional, which makes it more interesting in an inherently two-dimensional format. And having foreground, midground, and the foreground and the background can often add a little bit of context to the image and tell us a little bit more about what the story is. So when not to create depth? Well, I find you'll see occasionally, and especially with beginner photographers, is that they create depth because they know it's a technique that works, but not necessarily being deployed to enhance the story. So if there's no obvious and clear reason to be showing some foreground or some background in an image, then you're to ask the question of why am I doing it? And if you don't have a reason, if it doesn't come back to the subject and telling more information about the subject or the story, then I would suggest not doing it, as it will make the imagery look quite gimmicky. We might not want to create depth in an image where we're trying to create a more minimalist or abstract approach where the image feels very flat. And then a final reason not to add depth into an image is that you might be using it for commercial purposes where you know that there's going to be a graphic added on top. If you have lots of points of interest around the edges of the frame, like some foreground, potentially some flowers, for example, it's going to be very hard to layer the graphic on top of that and have a good amount of visual contrast.